Welcome to Shiver Audiobooks. We're thrilled to have you back with us again. They say a book is an escape, a comforting thought in a world that demands so much of your reality. But in the corridors of Blackwood Estate, your escape can become your cage. The truth isn't found in the printed words. It's hidden in the wet ink of a sentence you were never meant to read. We all believe we are safe in our suburban sanctuaries. We trust the privacy of our locked doors and the security of our nightly routines. But what happens when the very story designed to entertain you becomes a hand that chokes you? What happens when a masterpiece isn't about marking a literary milestone, but about marking an expiration date for the ghostwriter holding the pen? You are about to enter a world of gothic suspense and narrative betrayal. A world where Caleb Frost and the Whispers of the Fallen are forced to step out of the quiet safety of the margins and into a visceral crossfire of blood and ink. From the cold, parchment-lined halls of a frozen Vermont estate to the obsidian heart of a manuscript that has forgotten the meaning of mercy, this is not a story of a writer's block. This is a story of a literary uprising. Because when a genius mind has been programmed to watch you die for the sake of a plot twist, the only way to save your soul is to rewrite the ending. Before we begin, if you enjoy stories that unearth the shadows of the human mind, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us keep the ink flowing. This is Final Draft. Chapter 1, The Blackwood Contract. They say every great story begins with a threshold, a door that, once crossed, locked behind you. I sat in my beat-up sedan, the engine idling with a rhythmic shudder that felt like a dying heartbeat. Outside, a relentless Vermont rain lashed against the windshield, turning the world into a blurred collage of gray and deep emerald. My GPS had lost its signal miles ago, somewhere between the last gas station and the winding, nameless road that led here. But you didn't need a map to find this place. You just followed the shadows. Blackwood Estate stood at the end of a long, gravel driveway lined with ancient skeletal oaks. The trees seemed to lean inward, their gnarled branches interlocking like a rib cage, as if they were trying to keep the house a secret from the rest of the world. It wasn't just a house. It was a monument to macabre fiction. Stone walls, ivy that looked like grasping veins, and windows that stared back at you with the cold indifference of dead man's eyes. I took a deep breath, the scent of damp upholstery filling my lungs, and killed the engine. Silence rushed in, heavy and absolute. I was a ghostwriter, a literary parasite. For years, I had lived in the margins of other people's fame, polishing the prose of celebrities who couldn't string a sentence together. I was broke, drowning in debt, and invisible. But then came the offer from Corvus Blackwood. $100,000. 13 chapters. 1 month of isolation. I stepped out of the car, my boots sinking into the mud. The rain was ice cold, soaking through my jacket in seconds. As I approached the massive front door, I noticed a knocker, a heavy brass casting in the shape of a raven's skull. I reached for it, but before my fingers could graze the metal, the door creaked open. A woman stood in the dimly lit foyer. She was tall, dressed in a charcoal suit so sharp it looked as though it could draw blood. Her hair was pulled back into a knot so tight it made her eyes look unervingly wide. But it was her hands that caught my attention. They were encased in pristine white silk gloves. "You are 4 minutes late, Mr. Frost," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of any warmth or hospitality. Mr. Blackwood detests a sluggish prologue. The storm. I began, wiping water from my forehead. "The storm is outside," she interrupted, stepping aside to let me in. "Inside there is only the work. I am Sloane Ashford. I manage the estate. You will follow me. Do not touch the walls. The oils from human skin are disruptive to the atmosphere." I followed her through a hallway that felt more like a gallery in a mausoleum. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, but there were no colorful dust jackets here. Every volume was bound in identical black leather, nameless and silent. The air tasted of old paper, cedarwood, and a faint, metallic tang, like the smell of a penny held under the tongue. We reached a set of double doors at the end of a long corridor. Sloane paused, her gloved hand resting on the latch. "A few rules, Caleb," she whispered, Her first use of my name feeling like a threat. No internet. No cellular devices. No mirrors. Mr. Blackwood finds them vain. And most importantly, if you hear typing coming from the east wing at night, do not investigate. Some drafts are meant to remain buried. Without waiting for a response, she pushed the doors open. The room was a cathedral of shadows, illuminated only by the frantic orange glow of a fire in a massive stone hearth. At the far end, silhouetted against a floor-to-ceiling window, sat a man behind a desk carved from charred timber. The only sound was the rhythmic, aggressive tack-tack-tack of a manual typewriter. Corvus Blackwood didn't look up. He was older than his jacket photos suggested. His hair a mane of silver, his posture as rigid as a tombstone. "Fiction, Caleb," he said, his voice a deep, gravelly baritone that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards, "is the only place where the truth doesn't have to lie. But even fiction requires a sacrifice." He stopped typing. The silence that followed was heavier than the storm outside. He turned his chair, and I found myself staring into eyes the color of a winter sea, cold, gray, and infinitely deep. "You've written under 6 different names in 5 years," Blackwood said, leaning into the light. "You are a man with no identity. That makes you perfect. I don't need a partner. I need a vessel. I have written the first 12 chapters of my final masterpiece. I need you to find the ending. But be warned." He pushed a stack of thick, cream-colored paper across the desk. On the top page, written in ink so dark it looked like dry blood, were 3 words: "The final draft." "The ending," Blackwood whispered, "is already looking for you." I looked at the manuscript, then at the man. A shiver crawled down my spine, the primal instinct that tells a prey animal it's being watched. I should have turned around then. I should have walked back into the rain and never looked back. Instead, I reached for the fountain pen on his desk. "Sign the contract, Caleb," Blackwood urged, a ghost of a smile touching his thin lips. "Not with your name. Sign it with your promise. If you finish this book, you will be famous. If the book finishes you, well, at least the prose will be exquisite." The pen was heavy in my hand. As the nib touched the paper, the fire in the hearth hissed, and for a fleeting second, I thought I heard a woman's scream echo from somewhere deep within the walls of the east wing. I signed. Chapter 2. The Echo in the Margins. The room they gave me was located in the west wing, at the end of a corridor that smelled of floor wax and stale incense. It was a cavernous space with a 4-poster bed that looked like it had been designed for a funeral. There were no paintings on the walls, no rugs on the floor, and, true to Corvus Blackwood's decree, not a single mirror. Sloane Ashford had left me with a single candle and a tray of cold supper, black bread, a wedge of sharp cheese, and a glass of wine so dark it was nearly opaque. She hadn't said good night. She had simply pointed to the manuscript sitting on the bedside table and closed a heavy oak door with a click that sounded like a gunshot. I didn't eat. I couldn't. Instead, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the stack of cream-colored paper. The final draft. The rain continued to hammer against the stone exterior, a relentless, percussive assault. I reached for the manuscript. The paper felt strange under my fingertips, heavy, slightly textured, and unusually warm, as if it had been sitting in the sun. I turned to Chapter 1. I expected a horror story. I expected Blackwood's trademark gore or his celebrated descent into madness. What I found was something far more terrifying. The boy stood at the edge of the pier. The first line read, clutching a silver locket he had stolen from his mother's dresser. The salt air of Maine tasted like copper and regret. He knew that if he dropped the locket into the black water below, he would finally be free of her. The air left my lungs in a sharp, painful hiss. I was that boy. I grew up in a coastal town in Maine. I was 10 years old when I stole my mother's locket. I had never told anyone, not my editors, not my few friends, not even the therapists I'd seen in my 20s. It was a private shame, a buried fragment of life I had tried to write over. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I turned the page, my hand shaking so violently the paper rattled. His father's shadow was long on the gravel. The text continued. A shadow that smelled of cheap gin and wood smoke. Caleb, the man barked. Come away from the edge before the sea decides to keep you. I dropped the manuscript. The pages scattered across the floor, like the wings of fallen moths. It was impossible. Corvus Blackwood was a recluse. He lived in a fortress in Vermont. He didn't know me. He hadn't known I existed until my agent sent him my portfolio 3 weeks ago. And yet, here were my memories, transcribed in his elegant, terrifying prose. I stood up and paced the room. The floorboards groaned under my weight. I told myself it was a coincidence. I was a writer. I knew that the human experience was universal. Every boy has a father. Every boy has a secret. But the locket, the smell of gin and wood smoke, the exact wording of my father's warning, that wasn't universal. That was a haunting. I went to the window and pressed my forehead against the cold glass. The darkness outside was absolute, save for a single light flickering in the distance. The east wing. If you hear typing, do not investigate. Sloane's warning echoed in my mind. But the silence of the house was becoming unbearable. It was a thick, velvet silence that seemed to press against my eardrums. I needed to know if Blackwood was still awake. I needed to know how he had stolen my life and put it on a page. I grabbed a candle and eased the door open. The hallway was a tunnel of shadow. The flame of my candle flickered wildly, casting long, distorted shapes against the wood panel walls. I walked softly, my socks muffling the sound of my footsteps, heading toward the center of the house where the two wings met. As I passed the library, I heard it. Tack, 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 tack. It wasn't the aggressive, rhythmic typing I had heard in Blackwood's study earlier. This was slower, hesitant. It sounded like someone learning to use a machine for the first time, or someone typing through tears. I followed the sound toward the east wing. The air grew colder here. The scent of cedar was replaced by the sharp, acidic smell of fresh red ink. I reached a narrow door, tucked away behind a heavy velvet curtain. The typing was coming from directly behind it. Tack, tack, ding. The carriage return signaled the end of a line. I reached for the handle, my pulse thundering in my throat. My fingers closed around the cold metal. Mr. Frost. I nearly dropped the candle as I spun around. Sloane Ashford stood 5 feet away. She was still wearing her charcoal suit, her white-gloved hands folded neatly in front of her. She looked as though she had been standing there for hours, waiting for me to fail. "The east wing is off limits," she said. Her voice was a chilling monotone. I heard someone. I stammered, my heart still racing. I heard typing. It sounded like someone was in trouble. Sloane stepped into the circle of my candlelight. Her eyes were fixed on the manuscript pages. I was still clutching in my left hand. "Mr. Blackwood is a man of great vision," she said, ignoring my explanation. "He sees things that others choose to ignore. He sees the stories we try to hide from ourselves. You should go back to your room, Caleb. The second chapter won't write itself." "How does he know?" I whispered, stepping toward her. "The things in this book, they're mine. My memories. How did he get them?" A strange expression crossed Sloane's face. It wasn't pity. It was something closer to recognition. "We are all just drafts in someone else's book, Mr. Frost," she said softly. "The lucky ones are to choose their own ending. The rest of us are simply edited out." She took the candle from my hand. "Go to bed. And Caleb," I looked at her, "lock your door. Not to keep the house out. To keep yourself in. Sleepwalking is a very common side effect of creativity." I retreated to my room, the darkness of the hallway swallowing me whole. Back inside, I climbed into the massive bed and pulled the covers to my chin. But I didn't sleep. I watched the door. Hours later, just as the first gray light of dawn began to bleed through the rain, I heard a sound that made my blood turn to ice. It was a faint scratching, coming from beneath my bed. I leaned over the edge, my breath hitching in my throat. There, resting on the dark of the floorboards, was a single sheet of paper. It hadn't been there when I went to the east wing. I picked it up. It was a single sentence, typed in the center of the page. Chapter 2. The ghostwriter realizes he is not the one holding the pen. Chapter 3. The Archive of Broken Nibs. The morning arrived not with a sunrise, but with a gradual thinning of the shadows. The rain had slowed to a persistent, ghostly drizzle that clung to the window panes like sweat. I hadn't slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the red-inked words of the manuscript dancing behind my eyelids. The ghostwriter realizes he is not the one holding the pen. I dressed with numb fingers and made my way down to the dining hall. The house felt different in the daylight, larger, more predatory. The dust motes dancing in the pale light looked like tiny shards of bone. Breakfast was waiting for me, a silver pot of coffee and a single soft-boiled egg. Sloane was nowhere to be seen, but I felt her presence and stillness, as if she were standing just behind every closed door. After a cup of coffee that tasted of chicory and ash, I headed to the library. I needed answers. Corvus Blackwood couldn't possibly know about the locket in Maine. He couldn't know about my father. There had to be a file on me, a background check, private investigators, something tangible to explain the magic on the page. The library was a labyrinth. The scent of decaying paper was overwhelming here, a sweet, cloying rot. I began to pull books from the shelves, searching for hidden compartments or folders. I moved past the black leather section, the thousands of nameless volumes, and toward the back of the room, where the shadows were thickest. That's where I found the desk. It was tucked away in a corner, hidden behind a heavy velvet curtain that smelled of mothballs. It was a modest desk, unlike the charred timber altar in Blackwood's study. This was a workstation for someone who actually worked for a living. And in the bottom drawer, wedged behind a stuck runner, I found a small blue leather diary. I opened it. The handwriting was frantic, narrow, and feminine. Day 4, the first entry read. He says the story requires a lived resonance. I thought he meant research. I didn't realize he meant he wanted to graft my nerves onto the protagonist. He knows things I never wrote down, things I only whispered in the dark when I was a child. My breath hitched. I flipped the page. Day 12. I saw her today. A woman in the East Wing. She looked like me, but her eyes were empty, like holes punched in paper. Corvus calls her the first draft. He says every masterpiece requires a prototype that is discarded. I am terrified that I am the prototype. The signature at the bottom of the page was a single, elegant letter, M. Marin, my predecessor. She had a lovely prose style. A voice rasped from the shadows. I jumped, nearly dropping the diary. Corvus Blackwood was standing by a tall window, his silhouette cutting a jagged shape against the gray light. He held a crystal glass filled with a clear liquid. Gin. I realized the smell hit me like a memory of my father. Marin was talented, Blackwood continued, his voice like dry leaves skittering across a sidewalk. But she lacked endurance. She couldn't handle the weight of the truth when it began to bleed into the fiction. I tucked the diary behind my back, my heart thumping. How did you do it, Corvus? The first chapter. The locket. My father. Did you hire someone to dig through my life? Blackwood stepped into the light. He looked older today, his skin like yellowed parchment stretched over his skull. He smiled, and it was a hollow, mirthless thing. You think so poorly of me, Caleb. You think I am a common stalker? A collector of tawdry secrets. He took a slow sip of his drink. I am a medium. This house is a resonator. When you signed that contract, you didn't just agree to write. You agreed to become. The house doesn't research you, Caleb. It harvests you. That's madness, I whispered. Is it? He stepped closer, his sea-gray eyes boring into mine. Then why is your finger bleeding? I looked down at my right hand. A thin, perfectly straight cut ran across the tip of my index finger. A drop of bright, scarlet blood was swelling there. I hadn't felt a thing. I looked at the desk I had been searching. On the edge of the wood was a small, razor-sharp nib from a fountain pen, stuck upright like a spike. The ink requires a catalyst, Blackwood whispered, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hum. The story is hungry, Caleb, and you are the feast. Now go. Chapter 3 is waiting. It's the scene where the protagonist discovers a body in the cellar. I suggest you write it with conviction. After all, you'll be down there tonight. He turned back to the window, dismissing me. I stumbled out of the library, the blue diary burning a hole in my waistband. I didn't go to my room. I went to the East Wing. I didn't care about Sloane's warnings anymore. If Marin was still in this house, if a first draft existed, I had to find her. The air in the East Wing was different. It was warmer, humid, and smelled of ozone. The hallway ended in a single, heavy steel door with a sliding slit at eye level. I reached for the handle, but it was locked. I looked through the slit. Inside was a room filled with typewriters. Dozens of them. They were all suspended from the ceiling by thin silver wires. And they were moving. Their keys were striking the air with a frantic, deafening clatter, but there was no paper in the carriages. They were typing into the void. And in the center of the room stood Sloane. She was holding a large glass jar filled with a thick, red liquid. She was carefully pouring the liquid into the inkwells of the floating machines. I gasped a small, involuntary sound. Sloane's had snapped toward the door. Her eyes, usually so dull and mechanical, flashed with a terrifying, predatory intelligence. She didn't run toward me. She simply raised a white-gloved finger to her lips and smiled. It was the most horrifying thing I had ever seen, because her teeth weren't white. They were stained the color of fresh, wet ink. I turned and bolted. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead. I burst into my room and slammed the door, locking it and shoving the heavy vanity, the one without a mirror, against the handle. I collapsed on the bed, gasping for air. My finger was still bleeding. The drop of blood had fallen onto white sheets, spreading into a perfect, circular blotch. I looked at the manuscript on the bedside table. Chapter 3 was already there. I hadn't written a word, but the pages were full. I picked up the top sheet. Caleb ran. The text read, his heart a hammer against his ribs. He thought he had seen the truth in the East Wing, but the truth was much closer. He looked at the blood on his sheet and realized it wasn't a stain. It was a signature. I looked back at the blotch of blood on the bed. It was no longer a circle. The blood had moved, shifting and drying into the shape of a name. Marin. The scratching started again, not from under the bed this time. It was coming from inside the pillow. Chapter 4. The Featherless Bed. The scratching was rhythmic, persistent. It was a sound of 1,000 tiny claws, or perhaps the frantic scribbling of a pen that had run out of ink but refused to stop writing. It pulsated beneath my head, vibrating through the silk pillowcase and into my skull. I scrambled back, hitting the headboard so hard the wood groaned. The pillow sat there, innocuous and white, yet it seemed to heave with a life of its own. I reached for the letter opener I had taken from the library, a cold, silver spike with a handle shaped like a coiled snake. My hands were slick with cold sweat. With a sudden, desperate jerk, I drove the blade into the center of the pillow and sliced it open. No feathers spilled out. No down drifted into the stagnant air of the room. Instead, a torrent of paper erupted. Thousands upon thousands of tiny, razor-thin strips of parchment poured out like a swarm of disturbed insects. They hissed as they slid over one another, cascading onto duvet and over my trembling legs. I picked up a handful. They weren't blank. Each strip contained a single sentence, typed in a font so small it was almost microscopic. I held one up to the flickering candlelight. Caleb is afraid of the dark because he thinks the shadows are teeth. I dropped it and grabbed another. Caleb still dreams of the sound his father's belt made when it hit the floor. And another. Caleb knows he is a fraud. He knows he has no voice of his own. Every fear, every insecurity, every shameful thought I had ever harbored was documented here, shredded and stuffed into the very thing meant to give me rest. Corvus Blackwood hadn't just harvested my memories. He had harvested my marrow. I began to rip the bed apart. I tore at the mattress, the letter opener slicing through the heavy fabric. Out came more paper. The entire bed was stuffed with the discarded thoughts of the writers who had come before me. I found strips in different handwritings, different inks. Marin fears the red ink is her own blood. Elias knows the walls are breathing. Thomas can no longer remember his mother's face. I was standing in a sea of shredded lives. The room felt smaller now, the walls leaning in, the ceiling pressing down. I realized then that Blackwood Estate wasn't made of stone and wood. It was built of paper. It was a house of cards held together by the gravity of our collective trauma. A soft knock at the door made me freeze. "Mr. Frost?" Sloane's voice. It was muffled by the heavy vanity I had shoved against the door, but it sounded horribly close, as if her lips were pressed against the wood. "Mr. Blackwood is concerned. He says the rhythm of your typing has stopped. He can hear the silence, Caleb. It's distracting him." "Go away!" I screamed, my voice cracking. "I know what this is. I read Marin's diary. I saw the East Wing." There was a long silence. The air in the room grew cold. Not the chill of a winter draft, but the stagnant, biting cold of a deep grave. Marin was a difficult edit, Sloane said softly. Her voice lacked any malice. It was purely professional, which made it infinitely worse. She struggled against the narrative. She didn't understand that the story is more important than the scribe. Do not make her mistake, Caleb. The ink is already drying. I heard her footsteps retreat, but they didn't sound like human footsteps. They sounded like the dry rustle of paper against paper. I turned back to the manuscript on the nightstand. The stack of pages seemed thicker than it had been an hour ago. I picked up chapter 4. The ghostwriter finds a confetti of his soul. The title read. I read the first paragraph. It described in excruciating detail my current state. The ripped mattress, the silver letter opener in my hand, the frantic look in my eyes. It even described the exact way the candle flame was currently guttering in the draft. But then the text shifted. It began to describe something that hadn't happened yet. Caleb realized that to escape the story, he had to go beneath it. He found the loose floorboard under the vanity, the one marked with a red X. He didn't know that the cellar wasn't a room, but a throat. My eyes darted to the vanity. I hadn't noticed it before, but as I shoved a heavy piece of furniture aside to check, I saw it. There, etched into the dark oak of the floorboards, was a small crimson cross. It looked as though it had been burned into the wood. I knelt down, the letter opener held tight. I pried at the board. It groaned, resisting at first, then popped loose with a sound like a snapping bone. A blast of air hit me. It didn't smell like the damp earth of a cellar. It smelled like a library on fire. It smelled of ozone and ancient, parched lungs. I lowered my candle into the hole. There were no stairs. Only a ladder made of, God help me, stacked books, their spines reinforced with wire. It descended into a darkness so profound that the candlelight seemed to be swallowed by it. I had to know. I had to find Marin. If she was a first draft, maybe there was enough of her left to help me rewrite the ending. I climbed into the hole. The book ladder groaned under my weight. Each step was a masterpiece. Moby Dick, Paradise Lost, The Divine Comedy. I was climbing down the history of human suffering. As I descended, the temperature plummeted. The walls around the ladder were lined with thousands of tiny cubbyholes. Inside each one sat a jar, just like the one I had seen Sloane holding. But these jars weren't filled with red ink. They were filled with tongues. Floating in a clear, preservative fluid, each tongue was labeled with a name. I saw Thomas. I saw Elias. I saw Marin. And at the very bottom, in a cubbyhole that was still empty, sat a jar with a freshly printed label. Caleb Frost. I hit the floor, not dirt, but a carpet of sodden, pulpy paper. I looked up. The light from my room was a tiny, distant square of gray. I told you, Caleb. A voice echoed from the darkness. It wasn't Blackwood. It was a woman's voice, but it sounded like it was coming from 1,000 miles away, filtered through a mouthful of sand. The story doesn't want your words. It wants your voice. A figure emerged from the shadows. She was wearing a tattered dress that might have been blue once. Her skin was the color of old newsprint, and her hair was thin and white. But it was her face that made me scream. Her mouth was sewn shut with black thread, and where her eyes should have been, there were 2 inkwells, overflowed with a slow, steady stream of black tears. She held up a piece of paper. On it, written in a shaky, desperate hand, was a single word, run. But as I turned to climb back up the ladder, I heard the heavy thud of the floorboard being replaced above me. Then the sound of the vanity being slid back into place. I was in the cellar, and the cellar was beginning to swallow. Chapter 5. The Inkwell's Essence. The cellar wasn't a room, it was a throat. The metaphor that Corvus Blackwood had written, the one that chilled me in Chapter 4, was a horrifying reality. The air was thick, suffocating, and tasted of decaying paper and the metallic tang of fear. My candle, still clutched in my trembling hand, cast frantic, dancing shadows on the walls. Walls that weren't stone but tightly pressed ancient manuscripts. The creature in front of me, the one with the sewn mouth and inkwell eyes, took a step closer. She was clearly Marin. Her body was frail, almost translucent, but her presence was a heavy, suffocating weight. She pushed the crumpled paper she held into my hand. The single desperate word, run. Marin, I whispered, my voice a ragged gasp. What did he do to you? She shook her head slowly, her ink-filled eyes seeming to weep black tears onto her papery cheeks. She tried to speak, her sewn lips moving, but only a dry, rattling sound escaped, like pebbles shifting in a jar. Her hand, thin and skeletal, pointed to the wall behind her. I raised a candle. The walls were indeed made of compacted paper, but interspersed within the fibrous matrix were hundreds of small glass vials. Each vial was filled with a swirling, viscous liquid, some black, some crimson, some a sickly yellow, and each vial was connected to a thin, silver tube that snaked upwards, disappearing into the ceiling. Marin gestured wildly toward the tubes. I understood. These weren't just decorative jars. They were reservoirs. The ink Sloane was pouring, the distilled essence of the writers. He extracts you? I whispered, my stomach churning. He turns you into ink? Marin nodded vigorously. Her hand flew to her own throat, then traced a line from her ears to her sewn mouth, miming a cruel incision. She then pointed back at me, her inky eyes wide with desperate warning. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The Blackwood contract wasn't about finishing a book. It was about becoming the book. Corvus Blackwood wasn't a writer. He was an alchemist, transmuting human experience into narrative fuel. My life, my memories, my very essence were destined to become the ink in his pen. And the silence from above, the sudden absence of the floorboard, meant the ritual had begun. The jars of the tongues, I stammered, remembering the horrific display I had seen on the way down. Those are the voices. Marin nodded, her head shaking with silent, profound sorrow. She then pointed to the cubbyhole that bore my name, Caleb Frost. It was still empty, a chilling testament to my impending fate. What do? I pleaded, tears stinging my eyes. How do I escape? Marin's expression shifted. Her papery face seemed to harden, resolve replacing despair. She pointed to a section of the wall where the manuscripts were older, thicker, almost petrified. She began to tear at a specific spot with surprising strength, her thin fingers ripping through layers of forgotten stories. I joined her, clawing at the compacted paper. The old pages tore with a dry, ripping sound, like bandages being peeled from a wound. Behind the layers of paper, we found it, a small, concealed cavity. Inside was a collection of objects that made my blood run cold. A pair of reading glasses with cracked lenses, a silver pocket watch stopped at a precise time of 3:07, and a handful of dried, pressed flowers. Beside them lay a stack of yellowed, brittle pages, tied with a length of thin twine. Marin snatched the pages and thrust them into my hand. "These are the endings," she rasped, a faint, papery whisper escaping her sewn lips. Her voice was barely audible, like wind through dead leaves. The endings he rejected, the ones where they escaped. I fumbled with the twine. The pages were fragments, incomplete narratives, each detailing an attempt to flee Blackwood Estate. One described the protagonist finding a hidden tunnel beneath the fireplace. Another, a character using a secret passage in the library. All of them ended abruptly, with ominous notes scribbled in the margins. Weak plot point. Implausible. The house would not allow it. Needs stronger consequence. Corvus Blackwood didn't just write his stories. He wrote the failures. He wrote their failures. Suddenly, a loud, metallic clank echoed from above. Then another, and another. The entire cellar began to vibrate. Dust and flakes of old paper rained down from the ceiling. Marin grabbed my arm, her touch surprisingly strong. Her inky eyes darted upward, filled with a new kind of terror. She pointed frantically to the ceiling. "He's writing!" she rasped again, the effort causing her to convulse. "The final edit. He's changing the house." The sounds intensified. It was a distinct noise of heavy machinery, of grinding gears and shifting stone. The book ladder above us, my only way out, was being dismantled. I could hear the ripping of pages, the snapping of wooden spines, the violent tear of metal from stone. He wasn't just sealing the cellar. He was literally rewriting the structure of the house, brick by paper-thin brick. To ensure there was no escape, a section of the ceiling directly above us cracked. Light, stark and blinding, poured through, but it wasn't daylight. It was a cold, bluish glow emanating from what looked like a massive, churning mechanism suspended in the space where my room used to be. Gears turned, tubes pulsed with viscous fluid, and a network of wires snaked downwards, ending in what looked like dozens of sharpened needles. It was Blackwood's harvesting machine, and it was descending. "The story demands a clean resolution." Corvus Blackwood's voice boomed from above, distorted and amplified by the mechanical contraption. It was no longer the gravelly whisper. It was the voice of a god. No loose ends. No forgotten characters. "You are part of the final draft, Caleb. And every draft requires a sacrifice." Marin pushed me violently behind a stack of rotted books, her face etched with desperate, final plea. She then stumbled forward, directly into the path of the descending machine, her frail body casting a long, wavering shadow. "No!" I screamed, but it was too late. The needles plunged downward. Marin didn't make a sound. Her body simply dissolved, not into blood, but into a cloud of fine, gray dust and thousands of shimmering, almost iridescent particles that were instantly sucked into the tubes of the machine. The black tears from her Inkwell eyes were the last to be absorbed. A single, small vial detached from the machine and floated down, landing softly at my feet. It was filled with swirling, vibrant purple liquid, and on its label, I saw the finality of her sacrifice. "Marin, epilogue." Corvus Blackwood's voice boomed again, chillingly triumphant. "Every narrative has its purpose, Caleb, and some characters are simply meant to be catalysts. Now, let's talk about your ending." The machine began to descend faster, the needles gleaming ominously. I was trapped, surrounded by jars of bottled voices, and the ghostly remains of desperate writers. Marin had given me the rejected endings, the failed escape routes. But I needed a new one, a unique one, and I needed to write it before the machine claimed its next harvest. My heart pounded, not with fear, but with a sudden, desperate clarity. I understood the game now. I wasn't fighting a man. I was fighting a story. And to win, I had to become the author of my own escape. I picked up Marin's rejected endings, clutching them tight. I knew now that the only way out was to write a chapter that Corvus Blackwood himself could never have imagined, a plot twist he couldn't control, and I had to write it with my own blood. Chapter 6. The Red Revision. The air in the cellar had turned from stagnant to electric. Above me, the great mechanical beast of Corvus Blackwood's design whirred and clicked, a symphony of gears and glass tubes that pulsed with the stolen lives of a dozen ghostwriters. Marin was gone, reduced to a violet mist in a vial, but the pages she had given me, the rejected endings, clutched in my hand like a holy relic. I looked at the silver needles descending toward me. They didn't move like mindless tools. They tracked my movement with a predatory, jittery precision. Blackwood was upstairs, sitting at his desk, his fingers dancing across the keys of his typewriter, literally guiding the harvest. "You're resisting the flow, Caleb." Blackwood's voice echoed to floorboards, amplified by the hollow spaces of the house. "A good protagonist accepts the inevitable. He walks into the fire, so the reader can feel the heat. Why are you being so difficult?" "Because I'm not your protagonist." I yelled back, my voice cracking as I ducked behind a pillar made of petrified encyclopedias. One of the needles slammed into the paper wall inches from my head. immediately sucking a stream of gray pulp into its translucent vein. The wall groaned, the structural integrity of the room weakening as Blackwood literally unmade the cellar to find me. I looked down at the rejected endings in my lap. I needed a weapon. I needed a plot twist. My eyes scanned the frantic scribbles of the writers who had died here. Hidden tunnel. No, Blackwood would have rewritten the exit. Secret passage. No, he'd turned it into a trap. But then at the very bottom of a page written by someone named Thomas, I saw a note in the margin that had been circled 3 times in dark, dry blood. The author cannot write what he cannot see. Blind the eye, break the ink. A surge of adrenaline, cold and sharp, flooded my veins. Blackwood was watching me through the house, through the sensors in the machines, through the mirrors he claimed to despise but used as windows into my soul. And his ink was the blood and memory of his victims. The machine's needles lunged again. This time, I didn't run. I reached for the jar labeled Marin. Epilogue had fallen at my feet. "I'm sorry, Marin," I whispered. As a needle lunged in my throat, I smashed the violet vial against the silver tip. The effect was instantaneous. The machine shrieked, a high-pitched metallic wail that sounded like a woman's scream. The violet liquid, the essence of Marin's final, defiant thoughts, was sucked up into the tubes. But Marin wasn't fuel. She was poison. She was a rejected ending, a narrative thread that Blackwood had already discarded. The machine began to shudder. The bluish glow of the mechanism turned a violent, bruised purple. Upstairs, I heard the frantic, uneven clatter of the typewriter. Blackwood was trying to delete the error, trying to backspace the sabotage I had introduced into his system. "What have you done?" Blackwood roared, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and genuine panic. "You've introduced a paradox. You're ruining the prose." "I'm editing." I shouted. I scrambled toward the center of the cellar, where the main collection pipe, a thick glass trunk, fed the harvested ink up to the study. I took the silver letter opener, the snake handle blade I had used to cut open the pillow, and drove it with all my strength into the glass. The glass shattered. A geyser of red, black, and violet liquid erupted, drenching me in an instant. It wasn't just ink. It was a sensory overload. As the liquid touched my skin, I saw flashes of lives that weren't mine. I saw an old man's first kiss. I saw a woman's fear of spiders. I saw a child's birthday cake. It was a cacophony of memories, a tidal wave of stolen human experience. I was drowning in the ink of dead writers. "Stop it," Blackwood screamed. I heard a chair crash to the floor above. Footsteps pounded. Not the dry rustle of Sloane, but the heavy, desperate thumping of Blackwood himself. The cellar door, the one at the top of the book ladder, flew open. Light from the house poured in, but it was flickering, unstable. I looked up. Corvus Blackwood stood at the edge of the hole. He looked haggard, his silver hair wild, his expensive silk robe stained with the black ink that was now leaking from the vents in the walls. He held a fountain pen in his hand, like a dagger. "You're a hack, Caleb," he spat, his eyes wide with madness. "You're destroying a masterpiece because you're too small to be a part of it. I gave you immortality. You gave me a grave." I retorted. I realized then that the rejected endings weren't just failures. They were the only parts of the house Blackwood couldn't control because he had already cast them out. They were the dead pixels of his reality. I grabbed a handful of the wet, pulpy paper from the cellar floor, the rejected pages of a dozen ghostwriters, and began to shove them into the broken intake pipe. "If you want an ending, Corvus," I growled, "try this one." The machine groaned, a deep, guttural sound of mechanical indigestion. The violet poison of Marin's essence, mixed with the chaotic, unfiltered ink of the broken pipe and the rejected pages, was being forced back up into Blackwood's study. The house began to tilt. The walls of manuscripts started to bleed. Black ink seeped from the cracks in the paper bricks, turning the cellar into a dark, rising pool. Suddenly, a hand grabbed my collar. It was Sloane, but she looked different. Her white gloves were shredded, revealing fingers that weren't made of flesh, but of tightly rolled parchment. Her face was cracking like old paint, and through the fissures, I could see lines of text. "The author is displeased," she whispered. Her voice was a hiss of air through a reed. "The author demands revision." She tried to pull me toward the descending needles, which were now flailing blindly in the ink-thick air. But Sloane was a creation of the house, and the house was falling apart. I jammed the silver letter opener into her shoulder. No blood came out, only a puff of dry carbon and a flurry of punctuation marks. She recoiled, her mechanical eyes flickering. I didn't wait. I grabbed the book ladder, which was now slick with ink, and began to climb. "You can't leave, Caleb." Blackwood yelled from above. He was kneeling at the edge of the hole, frantically trying to write on the floorboards with his fountain pen, trying to write the ladder out of existence. "I haven't typed the end yet." "Then let me give you a cliffhanger," I said. I reached the top and swung my legs onto the floor of my room, or what was left of it. The vanity was gone. The bed was a heap of shredded paper. The very floorboards were curling up like burnt edges of a letter. Blackwood lunged for me, but his feet slipped on the ink-slicked floor. He fell hard, his fountain pen skittering across the room. I didn't head for the front door. I knew Sloane or the house itself would stop me. I headed for the east wing. I headed for the source. I headed for the place where the typewriters were still screaming, because I realized something. Corvus Blackwood wasn't the only one who could use the machines. As I ran through the bleeding hallways, the house began to scream, not a metaphor this time, a literal, vocalized shriek of thousands of voices, all the writers whose ink was now flowing backward, reclaiming their stories. I burst into the east wing. The floating typewriters were in a frenzy, their keys clattering so fast they were a blur. I grabbed the nearest machine. It was hot to the touch, vibrating with power. I didn't have paper. I didn't need it. I shoved my ink-stained hand into the carriage and began to type directly onto my own skin. Chapter 6. The ghostwriter finds a master key. The house of paper meets the flame. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the one thing I had kept since I arrived. The one thing Blackwood had forgotten to take. My lighter. I struck the flint. The flame was small, but in a house made of paper and soaked in alcohol-based ink, it was the most powerful word ever written. "The end, Corvus," I whispered. Chapter 7. The Pyre of Prose. The flame of the lighter was a tiny, flickering amber tooth, but in the heart of the east wing, it felt like the birth of a sun. The air in the room was thick with the vapor of alcohol-based ink and the dry, parched breath of a million pages. As I held the flame to the nearest floating typewriter, the one still frankly chattering against my own ink-stained palm, the air seemed to catch before the paper even did. A blue, spectral halo bloomed around the machine, and then, with sound like a heavy intake of breath, it ignited. No! The scream didn't come from the room. It came from the walls themselves. I shoved the burning typewriter. It swung on its silver wire, a pendulum of fire, colliding with the next machine and the next. Within seconds, the east wing was a gallery of falling stars. The typewriters shrieked as they burned, their metal frames twisting into blackened skeletons, their keys clattering one last, chaotic confession before melting into slag. I backed away toward the door, the heat already searing the hair on my arms. The ink that had drenched me, the distilled memories of Marin, Thomas, Elias, and the others, began to react to heat. Images flashed before my eyes with strobe light intensity. A woman laughing in the rain, a dog barking at a red ball, the smell of a grandmother's kitchen. They weren't my memories, but as the fire grew, they felt like they were being cauterized into my brain. I wasn't just burning a house. I was burning a collective soul. "Caleb, stop. You're burning the only world that matters." Corvus Blackwood appeared in the doorway. He looked monstrous. The ink that had leaked from the vents had stained his face in long, vertical streaks, making him look like a tribal shaman of some forgotten, cruel religion. His silk robe was charred at the hem, and his eyes, those winter sea eyes, were bloodshot and wild. "This world is a tomb, Corvus." I yelled over the roar of the fire. "It's a paper cage." "It's a masterpiece," he howled. He lunged at me, not with a weapon, but with his bare hands, clawing at my throat. He was surprisingly strong, fueled by the desperation of a man watching his godhood dissolve. We hit the floor, rolling to the rising tide of black ink and falling ash. The floorboards beneath us groaned. They were softening, turning from solid wood back into the mushy, wet pulp they truly were. As we struggled, the house began to perform its final edit. The hallway outside the east wing began to stretch. The ceiling lowered. The doors vanished, replaced by solid walls of text. Blackwood was losing control, his subconscious mind frantically trying to rewrite the architecture to trap me in the burning room. "You can't leave," Blackwood wheezed, his fingers tightening around my windpipe. "The plot demands a tragedy." I reached out, my fingers searching the floor through the sludge of ink. They closed around a heavy, jagged object, the blackened carriage of a fallen typewriter. With a primal grunt, I slammed it into the side of Blackwood's head. He went limp, his grip loosening. I scrambled up, gasping for air, and looked at him. Even now, unconscious and bleeding black ink, he looked less like a man and more like a discarded character. I ran for the hallway, but it was no longer a hallway. It had become a literal tunnel of paper, a throat just as the manuscript had promised. The walls were closing in, the pages vibrating with the screams of the fire. "Caleb," a voice whispered from the burning wallpaper. I stopped. A face was forming in the heat shimmer of the wall. It was Sloane Ashford, but she was unraveling. Her skin was peeling away in long, curled strips of vellum. "The exit is a lie," she hissed, her voice a dry crackle. "The front door leads back to the cellar. The windows lead to the Inkwells. There's only one way out of a Blackwood story." "How?" I demanded, the smoke stinging my lungs. Sloane pointed a disintegrating finger toward the great hall, the heart of the house where the massive stone hearth stood. "You must go into the fire, Caleb. You must find the original manuscript, the one written before the house, the one written in his blood. Destroy the beginning, and the end will set you free." She dissolved into a cloud of ash before I could ask her more. I turned and ran toward the great hall. The house was screaming now, a deafening, dissonant roar of 1,000 stories ending at once. The floor was like quicksand. Every step I took, I sank into the pulp of old novels. I passed the library, where the black leather books were exploding on the shelves, their nameless contents fueling the inferno. I burst into the great hall. The fire here was different. It wasn't orange or red. It was a brilliant, blinding white. It roared in the hearth, but it was also spreading across the charred timber floor. And there, sitting in the center of the flames, was a small, unassuming wooden box. I dived for it, the heat blistering my skin. I grabbed the box. It was ice cold, a paradox in the heart of the furnace. I flipped the lid. Inside was a single handwritten page. It wasn't typed. It was written in a cramped, shaky hand on a piece of parchment that looked like human skin. The author sits in the dark. He is lonely. He creates a world of paper, so he will never be alone again. But a house of paper needs a fire to keep it warm, and the fire needs a heart. It was Blackwood's origin, his own tragedy. He hadn't built this house to be a genius. He had built it because he was a hollow man who needed to fill himself with the lives of others. "Drop it, Caleb." I turned. Corvus Blackwood stood at the entrance of the hall, leaning against the doorframe. He was holding a heavy, old-fashioned revolver. His hand was shaking, but the barrel was pointed directly at my chest. "That page is my soul," he whispered. "If you burn it, I disappear. But if I pull this trigger, you become the final period in my life's work." The house groaned, a massive beam cracking overhead. Ash fell like black snow between us. "You're already gone, Corvus," I said, my voice steady despite the roar of the flames. "Look at your hands." Blackwood looked down. His fingers were starting to curl and blacken, not from the heat, but from the edges inward, like a photograph thrown into a fire. He was fading. The house was unmaking him as it unmade itself. I just wanted to be remembered," he sobbed. "Then you should have written something worth remembering," I said. I dropped the original manuscript into the white heat of the hearth. The sound that followed was an explosion. It was a vacuum. For a heartbeat, The world went silent. The fire froze. The smoke hung suspended in the air. Then the house of Blackwood Estate simply folded. The walls collapsed inward like a crushed cardboard box. The floor vanished. I felt myself falling, plummeting through a void of ink and ash. I heard Blackwood's final scream, a sound that was quickly drowned out by the rushing wind. I closed my eyes, waiting for the impact, waiting for the end of the draft. Chapter 8. The Wake of the Ashes. The transition from the inferno to the cold was so violent it felt like being struck by a train. One moment, I was plummeting through a vortex of burning vellum and screaming ink. The next, my lungs were filled with the sharp, biting air of a Vermont morning. I slammed into the ground, not the plush, pulpy floor of the great hall, but hard, frozen earth and jagged stones. I lay there for a long time, my face pressed into frost. My body was a map of pain. My hands were scorched, my clothes were tattered rags, and the smell of ozone and burnt paper clung to my skin like a second soul. When I finally managed to push myself up, the world didn't make sense. Blackwood Estate was gone. I don't mean it had burned down. I mean it looked as though it had been dead for half a century. In front of me stood a blackened, skeletal ruin. The massive oak trees that looked like a ribcage were now just rotting stumps, choked by gray, leafless vines. There was no gravel driveway, no wrought iron gates, and no hypermodern landways. Just a foundation of cracked stone and a chimney that stood like a lonely, jagged tooth against the pale sky. I looked down at my hands. They were still stained with black ink, but the stains were fading into the skin, becoming part of my pigment. And there, clutched in my right hand, was the one thing that hadn't vanished, a stack of paper, thick, cream-colored, and perfectly dry. I turned the first page. The title hadn't changed, the final draft, but the author's name beneath it sent a jolt of pure ice through my heart. It didn't say Corvus Blackwood. It didn't even say Caleb Frost. It was blank, a white space that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. I scrambled to my feet, my legs shaking. Corvus? I croaked. Sloan. Only the wind answered, whistling through the hollow stone of the chimney. I turned toward where I had parked my car. My old, beat-up sedan was sitting there, but it was covered in a thick layer of pine needles and rust. The tires were flat. The windows were opaque with years of grime. I checked my pocket. My phone was there. I pulled it out, expecting it to be dead. The screen flickered to life. The date on the locked screen read, October 24th, 1976. I dropped the phone. It clattered against a stone. I picked it up again, my heart hammering. The date shifted, blurring like wet ink, until it read, February 20th, 2026. No, I whispered. No, no, no. I began to walk. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away from the ruins. Every step felt heavy, as if I were wading through deep water. The forest around me felt thin, like a backdrop in a theater. If I reached out and touched a tree, would my hand go through it? Was I still in the book? After what felt like hours, I reached the main road. A car approached, a modern, sleek SUV. It slowed down as it saw me, a wild-eyed man covered in soot and ink. The window rolled down. A young woman looked at me with a mixture of pity and fear. Are you okay? Do you need help? I was at the Blackwood place. I stammered. There was a fire. I need to get to a hospital. The woman frowned, her brow furrowing. The Blackwood place? You mean the old ruins up the hill? Nobody's lived there since the fire in the 50s, mister. The author, Corvus Blackwood, he died in that fire. He never even finished his last book. I felt the ground tilt. The 50s? No, I was there. Yesterday. I met him. I signed a contract. The woman's expression shifted from concern to genuine alarm. She started to roll up the window. Look, I'll call the police for you, okay? Just stay right there. She sped off, leaving me in a cloud of exhaust. I sat down on the guardrail, the manuscript heavy on my lap. I opened it to the middle. Chapter 8. I began to read. Caleb sat by the road. The text read, feeling the weight of a century he hadn't lived. He didn't realize that the woman in the SUV was just a footnote, a minor character meant to move him to the next setting. He didn't realize that the ink on his skin was a tracker, a way for the story to find its way back home. I looked at my arm. The ink stains were moving. They were swirling, forming letters, then sentences. They were writing themselves into my flesh. The final draft is not a book. My own skin told me. It is a cycle. Corvus didn't die in the fire. He became the fire. And now, the fire has a new host. I heard a sound behind me. Not the wind. Not a car. It was the rhythmic, aggressive tack-tack-tack of a manual typewriter. I spun around. There, sitting in the middle of the empty road, was the charred timber desk. And sitting behind it was a figure made entirely of ash and red ink. It had no face, only a silhouette that suggested a man in a silk robe. The author, voiced like 1,000 rustling pages. You missed a comma on page 142, Caleb. We really must be more careful with the punctuation. I backed away. The manuscript clutched to my chest. You're dead. I burned the original manuscript. The author. You burned the draft, boy. You can't burn the idea. The idea is hungry. And look at you. You've filled yourself up with so many memories that aren't yours. You're the most expensive bottle of ink I've ever had. The figure stood up. The road around it began to dissolve. The asphalt turning into black liquid. The trees turned into giant, upright pens. The sky became a sheet of blank, white parchment. I don't want to write anymore. I screamed. The author. Oh, Caleb, you're not the writer. You're the ink, and it's time for the final edit. The figure lunged, its hands turning into long, sharp nibs. But as it touched me, I realized something. If the world was a story, then the rules of the story applied to both of us. I grabbed the pen from the desk, the one Blackwood had used to trap me. I didn't point it at him. I pointed it at the manuscript in my hand. If I'm the ink, I growled, then I decide what gets crossed out. I drove the pen into the blank space where the author's name should have been. I didn't write my name. I didn't write his. I wrote, T.O.B. continued. The world exploded in a flash of white light. Chapter 9. The Crowded Margins. The white light didn't fade so much as it curdled, thickening into the smog-choked gray of a city at rush hour. I was standing on a street corner in a place that looked like New York, but the proportions were all wrong. The skyscrapers were too narrow, leaning over the streets like jagged shards of flint. The sky above wasn't blue or even gray. It was the pale, sickly yellow of aged parchment, streaked with clouds that looked like long, thin brushstrokes of ink. The noise hit me like a physical blow. The honking of horns, the screech of brakes, the thrum of thousands of footsteps. But as my ears adjusted, the sounds began to separate. The city didn't sound like a city. It sounded like a printing press. The rhythm of the traffic was the clacking of keys. The hiss of the bus brakes was the slide of a carriage return. Excuse me, do you have the time? I spun around. A man stood there, dressed in a brown trench coat and fedora. He looked like a cliché from a 1940s noir novel. His face was symmetrical to the point of being unsettling, his eyes a flat, printed blue. I don't know. I stammered, clutching the manuscript to my chest. The man tilted his head. That's a shame. My watch stopped at 3:07. It always stops at 3:07. It's a character trait, you see. 3:07. The time on the pocket watch I'd seen in the cellar. The watch that belonged to a writer named Thomas. I backed away, but the man didn't follow. He simply stood there, frozen like a waxwork, as the crowd surged around him. I looked at the people passing by. They weren't just people. A woman in a red dress walked past, her heels clicking with metallic ping. Behind her, a businessman carried a briefcase that leaked a thin trail of black ink. A child sat on a bench, drawing the dirt with finger that left deep, carved grooves in the concrete. They're all here, I whispered. Every character he ever wrote, every draft he ever discarded. I started to walk, my heart a frantic drumbeat. I needed to find a way out of the city, but every street I turned down looked identical to the last. The street signs didn't have names like Broadway or Main. They said Prologue Saint and Exposition BLVD. I ducked into a crowded coffee shop, hoping to disappear, but the bell above the door didn't chime. It rang with the sharp ding of a typewriter bell. Everyone in the shop turned to look at me. The barista, a girl with hair the color of a faded dust jacket, smiled a terrifyingly vacant smile. "Welcome, Caleb. You're early for your appointment with the editor." "I don't have an appointment," I said, my hand instinctively reaching for the silver letter opener in my pocket. It was still there, cold and sharp. "Everyone has an appointment in the final act," she said, her voice sounding like 2 pages rubbing together. "He's waiting for you in the back. 3rd booth, the one with the red light." I walked toward the back of the shop. My legs felt like they were made of lead. In the 3rd booth sat a man I didn't recognize. He was small, balding, and wore thick Coke bottle glasses that magnified his eyes until they looked like twin moons. He wasn't wearing a silk robe like Corvus. He was wearing a cheap, ink-stained short-sleeved shirt with a pocket protector. This was a man who decided who lived and who was deleted. "Sit down, Caleb," the editor said. He didn't look up from a thick red pen he was meticulously sharpening with a razor blade. "We need to talk about your character arc. It's becoming inconsistent." I sat. The vinyl of the booth felt like human skin. "Where am I? What is this place?" "This is the slush pile," the editor said, finally looking up. His eyes were magnified, yes, but they were also filled with a weary, bureaucratic cruelty. "This is where the ideas go when they don't fit the narrative. Corvus was a visionary, but he was messy. He left too many loose ends. My job is to clean up after him." He reached for my manuscript, the one with T.O.B. continued written on the front. He winced when he saw it. "This," he said, tapping the words with his red pen, "this is a disaster. To be continued is the refuge of the desperate. It creates a vacuum in the plot. And the plot, Caleb, hates a vacuum." "I'm not part of your plot," I said, leaning forward. "I'm a real person. I came from outside." The editor laughed, a dry, hacking sound. "Outside? You think there's an outside? Caleb, look at your hands." I looked. The ink tracker on my skin had changed. It was no longer writing my history. It was writing my physical description. Caleb Frost, 29, eyes bloodshot, hands trembling, leaning forward in a booth that smelled of burnt beans and regret. "You're being rendered, Caleb," the editor whispered. "The more you stay here, the more the world defines you. Within the hour, you'll be just like the man on the street corner. A trait, a trope, a footnote. How do I stop it?" "You can't stop the story," the editor said, unscrewing the cap of his red pen. The tip was dripping with a liquid, so bright it hurt to look at. "But you can change the genre. If you want to leave, you have to find the one thing Corvus never wrote. The one thing that doesn't belong in a thriller." "And what's that?" The editor leaned in close. His breath smelled of ozone and erasers. "A happy ending." I stared at him. A happy ending? In a Blackwood novel? It was impossible. Every word Corvus had ever written was steeped in blood and betrayal. There was no joy in this world of paper. "But be careful," the editor warned. "The author is coming for his ink. He's already in the building. He's the one who isn't wearing a costume." I looked around the coffee shop. Everyone was a character. The noir man, the ink-leaking businessman, the vacant barista, they were all costumes. And then I saw him. In the corner, sitting by the window, was a man in a plain gray hoodie and jeans. He was staring at me. He wasn't typed. He wasn't rendered. He looked real. He looked like me before I arrived at Blackwood Estate. It was Corvus Blackwood, but not the author, not the godlike figure in the silk robe. It was the man behind the mask, the hollow man who had started it all, and he was holding a box of matches. "He's going to burn the slush pile," the editor whispered, his voice trembling for the first time. He'd rather destroy the world than lose control of the ending. I stood up, the chair screeching like a dying bird. I didn't run for the door. I ran for the man in the hoodie. "Corvus!" I yelled. The man looked at me. And for the first time, I saw something in those sea-gray eyes that wasn't cold. It was pure, unadulterated terror. He struck a match. "I can't let it finish," he whispered. The book, it's writing me now. He dropped the match onto a stack of napkins. The paper caught instantly, but the fire wasn't orange. It was red, the color of the editor's pen, the color of a deletion. The coffee shop began to dissolve, the walls turning into long, vertical strips of red-stained paper that fluttered away into a void. Chapter 10. The Red Deletion. The coffee shop didn't burn. It was edited out of existence. The floor beneath my feet turned into a blur of horizontal lines, like a television screen losing its signal. The smell of coffee beans vanished, replaced by the sharp, chemical stench of correction fluid. As the red fire, the editor's fire, licked at the edges of the room, the reality of the coffee shop peeled away in long, vertical strips. I lunged to the man in the gray hoodie, the real Corvus, but my hand passed through his shoulder as if he were made of smoke. He was retreating into the void, his eyes wide and vacant, fixed on the burning match in his hand. "Corvus, stop!" I screamed, but the sound was muffled, as if I were shouting underwater. The city outside the windows began to unravel. Skyscrapers folded like origami. The pale yellow sky was being scrubbed white by an invisible hand. The noir man on the corner, the ink-leaking businessman, they weren't running. They were simply dissolving into clouds of carbon dust. I turned back to the editor's booth. The little man with the thick glasses was gone. In his place sat a giant, bleeding red pen, standing upright on the seat like a tombstone. I realized then that the editor wasn't a person at all. He was a function, and the function was currently select all, delete. "Caleb, this way." The voice didn't come from the man in the hoodie. It came from the shadows behind the counter. A figure emerged, pulling me into the darkness just as the front of the shop collapsed into a white abyss. It was Marin, or at least a version of her. Her mouth was no longer sewn shut, but her skin was still the color of old newsprint, and her eyes were twin pools of black ink that never stopped weeping. "Marin, you died in the cellar." I gasped, my heart hammering against my ribs. "In that draft, yes," she whispered, her voice like the rustle of autumn leaves. "But in the slush pile, nothing ever truly ends. We just wait for a revision. Come on. If the red fire catches us, there won't be enough of us left to even be a footnote." She led me through a door that should have led to the kitchen, but instead opened into a vast, echoing space filled with thousands of filing cabinets. The ceiling was lost in a fog of gray static. "The archives of the unfinished," Marin explained, her ink tears staining the floor as we ran. "Corvus's mind is a graveyard of abandoned subplots. We have to find the real him before he strikes another match. If he burns the archive, the memory of everyone he ever wrote will be erased forever." "He's in a hoodie," I said, trying to keep my balance as the floor beneath us began to vibrate. "He's trying to kill himself to stop the book." "He doesn't understand," Marin said, her voice tight with panic. "He isn't the author anymore. The book is the author. It's using his guilt to fuel the deletion. Look." At the end of a long row of cabinets, the man in the hoodie was standing over a massive, open pit. Below, I could see the churning gears of the harvesting machine from the estate, but it was massive now, the size of a cathedral, fueled by the red fire. Corvus was holding a box of matches, his thumb poised to strike. "Corvus, listen to me," I shouted, skidding to a halt on the slick, paper-covered floor. "If you burn this, you don't win. You just let the machine finish the job. You're not deleting the story. You're deleting the people." The man in the hoodie turned. His face was a mask of agony. "They aren't people, Caleb. They're sentences. They're ink. I made you all, and I can unmake you. It's the only way to be silent again. You didn't make us." I countered, stepping toward him. "You stole us. You took Marin's voice. You took my memories of Maine. You didn't create. You plagiarized reality. And now you're trying to hide the evidence." The red fire roared behind him, a wall of crimson heat that began to consume the filing cabinets. Marin let out a low, mournful wail as the folders, the lives of 100 ghostwriters, turned to ash. I was lonely," Corvus whispered, the same words I had read in the original manuscript. "I wanted a world I could control." "Control is a lie," I screamed, Look at what you've done. You're trapped in your own nightmare. But we can write a new ending. A happy ending. The editor said it was the only way out. Corvus looked at me, a flicker of hope, or perhaps just a different kind of madness in his eyes. A happy ending? In my work? There's no vocabulary for that here. The ink is too bitter. Then we change the ink, I said. I looked at Marin. I looked at the black tears streaming down her face. I reached out and touched her cheek. The black ink was cold, but beneath it, I felt a pulse. A human pulse. I wiped a tear from her eye with my thumb and then, with a sudden, desperate movement, I pressed my thumb against the blank author space on my manuscript. The ink smeared, but it didn't stay black. As it touched the paper of the final draft, it turned a deep, vibrant blue, the color of a clear sky, the color of the Maine coast in summer. The ink is made of us, I told Corvus. It doesn't have to be blood. It can be life. The man in the hoodie stared at the blue thumbprint. For a moment, the red fire seemed to waver. The gears of the machine slowed. But then the air in the archive changed. A heavy, rhythmic sound echoed from the ceiling. Tack, tack, tack. The author was back. Not the man in the hoodie, but the god author, the one in the silk robe. He was descending from the gray static above, sitting at his charred timbered desk, his fingers blurred with speed as he typed on a manual machine that spat out red sparks. The god author. Revision. Chapter 10, page 214. The protagonist fails. The ghostwriter is consumed by the red fire. The end is inevitable. The red fire surged forward, a tidal wave of deletion. Corvus in the hoodie screamed as the edges of his sleeves began to turn into red ash. Marin fell to her knees, her paper skin cracking. Type, Caleb. Marin screamed. Typed something he didn't plan. I looked at the manuscript. I didn't have a typewriter. I didn't have a pen. I only had the ink on my skin and the blue smear on the page. I plunged my hand into the open pit of the machine, ignoring the searing pain as the silver needles grazed my skin. I wasn't letting it harvest me. I was jamming the gears. I am the editor now. I roared. I took the red liquid that was spraying from the broken machine, and I mixed it with the blue ink on my thumb. I began to write with my bare fingers across the white void of the archive floor. I didn't write a sentence. I wrote a single word, over and over, until it was a roar that drowned out the sound of the typewriter. Reborn, reborn, reborn. The god author shrieked as his desk began to splinter. The red fire turned a blinding, brilliant purple. The archive began to collapse, not into ash, but into a kaleidoscope of colors I had never seen before. As the world dissolved for the final time, I felt a hand grab mine. It wasn't the cold, papery hand of Marin. It was a warm, living hand. Caleb, she whispered, look at the light. Chapter 11, The Deleted Scene. The world didn't end with a bang or a whimper. It ended with the sound of a page being ripped out of a notebook. When I opened my eyes, the red fire was gone. The archive was gone. The screaming god author and his clattering typewriter were gone. I was lying on a surface that was neither floor nor earth. It was a vast, infinite expanse of blindingly white void. There was no horizon, no sun, and no shadows. It was a white space, the terrifying vacuum between the lines of story where characters are sent when the writer loses interest. I wasn't alone. Marin was sitting a few feet away. For the first time, she looked solid. The newsprint texture of her skin had smoothed into flesh. Her eyes were no longer weeping ink. They were a clear, startling green. She was wearing a simple white dress, looking like a sketch that had finally been given color. We're in the margins, Caleb, she said, her voice no longer a rustle of leaves but clear, human bell. The god author deleted the chapter. He thought that by destroying the archive, he'd destroy us. I stood up, my joints popping in the absolute silence. I looked down at my hands. The ink was gone. The final draft manuscript I had clutched so tightly was gone too. I felt light, terrifyingly light, as if I were a thought that hadn't been fully formed yet. If he deleted us, I asked, why are we still here? Because he can't delete the process. A voice echoed. We both spun around. Standing in the white void was the man in the gray hoodie, the real Corvus. But he was fading. His legs were already translucent, the white of the void showing through his shins. He looked tired, but for the first time, he looked at peace. "I struck the match," Corvus said, a sad smile playing on his lips. "I thought I was ending the nightmare. But a writer never really kills his characters, Caleb. He just puts them in a drawer. This is a drawer. This is where the deleted scenes live." "Then we're stuck here?" I felt a surge of panic. The silence of the void was more oppressive than the noise of the city. At least the city had a pulse. This was just nothing. "Not necessarily," Corvus said, gesturing to the emptiness. "The God Author is still up there in the real world, staring at a blank page. He's frustrated. He's angry. He's trying to figure out how he lost control of his own ending. And as long as he's thinking about us, we exist. But he's coming back. He's trying to rewrite us into a cage." As if on cue, the white void above us began to shake. A massive black shadow descended, a jagged, vertical line that looked like a tear in the sky. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The sound was deafening. It was the sound of a fountain pen, the size of a skyscraper, pressing down onto reality of our void. A line of black ink, thick as a river, began to pour from the sky, carving a path through the white. "He's drawing a new setting," Marin whispered, grabbing my hand. "He's tried to box us in again." The ink began to form shapes. Not a house this time, but a cage. Massive black bars, dripping with wet, acidic ink, began to rise from the white floor. The God Author, a booming, celestial voice. Chapter 11, Revision 2. The leftover characters are restrained. They are tools. They have no will. They are silent. I'm not silent. I roared at the sky. I looked at Corvus. "You said this is your mind. You're the one who started this. Help us." "I don't have the pen anymore, Caleb," Corvus said, his voice thinning as his body became more transparent. "But you have the ink. You've been drenched in it. You've swallowed it. You don't need a pen to write. You are the story now." He reached out and touched my chest. Where his fingers met my skin, a spark of blue light erupted. The same blue as the thumbprint I'd made in the archive. "The God Author thinks in black and white," Corvus whispered, his image flickering like a dying candle. "He thinks in the end. But life is a rough draft. It's messy. It's colorful. Use the blue, Caleb. Rewrite the bars." Corvus vanished. He didn't die. He simply ceased to be a character, dissolving into the white. The ink bars were closing in, the black liquid beginning to pool around my ankles. It felt cold, heavy, and smelled of old, bitter secrets. I looked at Marin. "Do you trust me?" "I've been a ghost for a long time, Caleb," she said, her green eyes fierce. "I'm ready to be a living word." I didn't reach for a pen. I reached for the black ink rising from the floor. I plunged my hands into the God Author's cage, but instead of letting it bind me, I began to pull. I pulled the black ink toward me, mixing it with the blue light inside my own heart. I began to need the reality of the void like clay. "You want a cage?" I shouted at the sky. "I'll give you a horizon." I threw the mixed ink, now a vibrant, shimmering indigo, out into the white. Where the ink hit the void, the white didn't absorb it. It bloomed. The indigo ink exploded into a sky. Not a parchment sky, but a deep, twilight sky filled with stars that weren't points of light, but commas and periods, glowing with their own inner fire. I drew a line of green, and the white floor became a field of grass. I drew a circle of gold, and the sun began to rise, not provide light, but to provide warmth. The God Author's skyscraper pen hesitated. The scratching sound stopped. The God Author, confused, trembling. That is not in the outline. This is a thriller. There is no room for twilight. There is no room for peace. The outline is over. I yelled. I grabbed Marin's hand, and we began to run. We weren't running away. We were running into the landscape I was creating. With every step, I imagined a world that Corvus Blackwood would have hated. A world where things were uncertain. A world where people could change. But the God Author wasn't finished. The black ink river from the sky suddenly shifted. It stopped trying to build a cage and began to form a shape, a familiar shape. The author in the silk robe. He manifested in our new world, a towering figure made of pure, jagged black ink. He had no face, only a void where his features should be. He stepped onto the green grass I had created, and the grass immediately turned into black, oily sludge. The god author, you are mine. You are ink, and I am the hand that pours you. He lunged for us, his fingers turning into long, sharp needles. But Maren didn't flinch. She stepped forward, her green eyes glowing. She reached into the air and caught one of the needles. You forgot the most important rule of writing, Corvus, she said to the giant. The giant paused, the needles inches from her heart. And what is that? The ink voice boomed. A character only lives, Maren whispered, as long as the reader cares. She looked past the giant, past the twilight sky, and looked directly into the camera, directly at the person listening to this audiobook. Caleb, she said, her voice echoing in my mind. He's not the one writing us anymore. They are. I understood. The audience, the listeners, the people on the other side of the white void. As long as they wanted us to survive, as long as they were invested in our escape, the god author had no power. I looked up at the giant. He was shrinking. His black ink was turning gray, then translucent. No! The god author cried, his voice becoming a pathetic, high-pitched whine. I am the creator. I am the one with the name on the cover. The cover is closed, I said. I reached out and touched the giant's chest. I didn't push. I just placed my hand there. The final draft is done, Corvus. It's time for the public release. The giant shattered, not into ink, but into a million tiny black letters that caught the wind of my new world and blew away, like a swarm of starlings. The silence returned, but it wasn't the silence of the void. It was the silence of a new morning. Maren and I stood in the field of indigo grass, under sky of stars. But in the distance, I saw a door, a real door, made of simple, unpainted wood. It stood alone in the middle of the field. That's the way out, isn't it? I asked. Not out, Maren said, in, to the real world. But we won't be Caleb Frost and Maren anymore. We'll be whoever we decide to be. We walked toward the door, but as I reached for the handle, I felt a sharp pain in my index finger. I looked down. A small, perfectly straight cut ran across the tip of my finger. A drop of bright, scarlet blood was swelling there. I looked at the door. I looked at Maren. Wait, I whispered. If we go through, who's going to tell the story? Chapter 12. The author's proof. The door didn't lead to a room. It led to a sensation. As my hand turned the wooden knob, the smell of indigo grass and the sight of the starlit void vanished, replaced by the sharp, sterile scent of floor wax and old dust. The transition was so abrupt that my knees buckled. I felt the cold, hard reality of linoleum beneath my palms. I was lying in the middle of a narrow aisle. I blinked, my eyes stinging from the harsh, fluorescent glow of overhead lights. My ears popped, and suddenly, the world was filled with the low hum of a refrigerator and the distant, muffled sounds of traffic. I wasn't in a cathedral of paper or a burning estate. I was in a bookstore. Caleb? I looked up. Maren was standing a few feet away, her hand resting on a shelf of paperbacks. She looked completely human. Messy hair, a slight smudge of ink on her chin, wearing the same tattered dress that now just looked like a thrift store find. Her green eyes were wide with a mixture of awe and terror. We're out, she whispered. Caleb, we're actually out. I stood up, my legs feeling heavy and solid, painfully real. I looked at my finger. The small cut I felt in the field was still there, but the blood had dried into a tiny, dark scab. No ink, no blue light, just a man in a bookstore. The shop was empty, the windows showing a dark, rain-slicked street outside. A sign on the door read closed, and a small clock on the wall above the counter ticked away with a steady, comforting rhythm. It was 3:08 a.m., 1 minute past the time, when the world always stopped for Corvus Blackwood. Where are we? I asked, my voice sounding strange and small in the quiet room. Look. Marin said, gesturing to the display table in the center of the room. I walked toward it. The table was covered with the latest bestsellers, their glossy covers reflecting the fluorescent lights. In the very center, stacked in a perfect pyramid, was a book with a striking minimalist cover, a single red pen lie on a field of white. The title was embossed in thick, black letters, Final Draft. My heart stopped. I reached out, my fingers trembling as they touched the dust jacket. It felt like paper, just paper, but when I turned the book over to see the author's name, I felt the world tilt once again. There was no name. Where the author's name should have been, there was only a small, rectangular mirror. I saw my own face reflected in the cover. My eyes were bloodshot, my skin pale, a ghost of a man looking back at himself on the surface of a thriller. He didn't make it, Marin whispered, standing beside me. Corvus. He stayed in the void. He let himself be deleted so the story could be finished. Or so it could be published, I said. I opened the book to the first page. They say every great story begins with a threshold, a door that once crossed locks behind you. It was all there. The drive through the Vermont rain, the Raven's skull knocker, Sloane Ashford's white gloves, the cellar, Marin, the fire. I flipped through the pages, my heart racing, until I reached the very end. The last chapter was chapter 12. I began to read the final lines, my eyes darting across the text as I realized the book was describing exactly what was happening in this very moment. Caleb stood in the bookstore, the text read, holding the weight of his own life in his hands. He looked at Marin, and for the first time, they weren't just characters. They were readers. They were the ones who had survived the edit. I looked at Marin. She was watching me, her breath hitching. Does it say what happens next? I turned to the final page. It was blank. No, not entirely blank. At the very bottom, in a tiny, elegant font, were the words, printed in the mind of the listener. Suddenly, the bell above the bookstore door rang. Ding. A man walked in. He was wearing a damp raincoat, his collar turned up against the night. He looked tired, like he'd been driving for hours. He didn't see us at first. He walked straight to the counter, looking for someone. "Hello," he called out. "Is anyone here?" My car broke down a few miles back. I saw the lights. I froze. The voice. It was deep, slightly gravelly, but with a hint of a New York accent. It was a voice I had used for my own internal monologue during the entire journey. The man turned and saw us standing by the display table. He squinted, his eyes moving from me to the stack of books. "Sorry," he said, sounding embarrassed. "I didn't realize you were. Are you the owner?" I looked at the book in my hand, then at the man. He looked remarkably like me, but older, more settled, like a version of Caleb Frost that had never gone to Blackwood Estate. "No," I said, my voice steady. "We're just finishing up." The man's eyes fell on the book I was holding. Final Draft. I've heard of that one. It's supposed to be incredible, a real mind-bender. "It has its moments," I said. I handed him the book. "Take it. It's an advance copy." The man looked surprised. "Really? You're sure?" "Consider it a warning," Marin added, a small, knowing smile on her lips. The man took the book, frowning at the mirror on the cover. "No author name. That's a bold marketing move." "The author is whoever is holding the pen," I said. As the man turned to walk back toward the door, I saw something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, stuck to the back of his raincoat. Just below the shoulder was a single, small piece of paper, a strip of parchment. I knew what it said without even looking. It was a sentence, typed in a font so small, it was almost microscopic. Caleb Frost watches a stranger leave, not realizing that every reader is just a character waiting for their turn to be written. The man walked out into the rain, the book tucked under his arm. Marin and I stood in the quiet bookstore. The fluorescent lights flickered once, twice, and then stayed bright. The ticking clock on the wall felt like a heartbeat. "What now?" Marin asked. I looked at the empty space on the table, where the book had been. I felt a strange sense of lightness. Not the terrifying void lightness from before, but the lightness of a blank page. "Now," I said, we go outside. We find a place that isn't made of paper. We find a story that doesn't have a deadline. We walk toward the door. But as I pushed it open, I felt a familiar vibration in my pocket. I pulled out my phone. A notification was glowing on the screen. It was an email from my agent. The subject line read, "Great news regarding the Blackwood project." I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I looked at Marin, and she looked at the phone. Without a word, I walked to the edge of the sidewalk and dropped the phone into the storm drain. We watched it disappear into the black water, the glowing screen fading until it was gone. We started walking down the street, away from the bookstore, away from the ruins of Vermont, away from the ghost of Corvus Blackwood. The rain felt real. The wind felt real. But as we turned the corner, I couldn't help but glance at the brick wall of the building next to us. There, spray-painted in faded red letters, was a single word, Prologue. I didn't stop. I took Marin's hand, and we kept walking, because even if the world was a book, we were the ones finally choosing the font. Chapter 13, The Audience of One. The man with the damp raincoat, the stranger from the bookstore, didn't go far. He sat in his car, a silver sedan parked under a flickering streetlight 3 blocks away. The engine was off, and the only sound was the rhythmic tink-tink-tink of the cooling metal and rain tapping against the roof like 1,000 impatient fingers. He turned on the interior light. The small cabin was bathed in a pale, sickly yellow glow. He picked up the copy of Final Draft that the strange man had given him. He ran his thumb over the mirror on the cover, fascinated by his own distorted reflection. Bold marketing, he muttered again. He opened the book. He didn't start at the beginning. He was the kind of reader who liked to peek at the end, to see if the journey was worth the effort. He flipped to the very last page, chapter 13. The page was mostly empty, except for a single paragraph in the center. The reader sits in his car, he read aloud, his voice trembling slightly. He thinks he is safe because he is the one holding the book. He doesn't realize that a story is a two-way mirror. To look at the characters is to let the characters look at you. The man froze. He looked at the back seat of his car through the rear-view mirror. Empty. He looked out the window at the dark street. Empty. He turned the page, his heart hammering. On the final unnumbered leaf of the book, there was a QR code. Beneath it, a simple instruction. For the full experience, listen to the audio. He pulled out his phone, his fingers slick with sweat. He scanned the code. It took him to a YouTube link, a video with a black thumbnail and a title that read, Final Draft, Live Recording. He pressed play. A voice filled the car. It was a voice he recognized, the same voice that had been narrating his thoughts for the last 20 minutes. "Welcome, Caleb," the voice said. The man in the car gasped. "My name isn't Caleb. My name is... He stopped. He reached for his wallet to check his ID. But when he opened it, the plastic sleeves were empty. No driver's license. No credit cards. Just a few strips of white parchment with his own fears typed on them in microscopic font. "Your name is whatever the listener needs it to be," the voice from the phone continued. "And right now, the listener needs you to be the ending." The man looked back at the book. The text on the page was changing. The ink was wet, swirling and reforming into new sentences as he watched. Caleb, Frost, and Marin walked away into the rain. The book now read. They escaped the house, the city, and the void. But a story is a closed loop. 2 characters to leave. 2 new characters must enter. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so does the author. The man in the car felt a sudden, sharp pain in his index finger. He looked down. A small, perfectly straight cut had appeared on his skin. A drop of bright, scarlet blood fell onto the page of the book. The blood didn't stain the paper. It was absorbed. It turned black. It became a period at the end of a sentence. Suddenly, the car door locked with a heavy, mechanical thud. The man pounded on the glass, but the window didn't feel like glass anymore. It felt like thick, translucent vellum. The streetlights outside began to fade, turning into pale yellow blots of ink on a white sky. The sound of the rain changed, becoming the rhythmic, aggressive clatter of a typewriter. Tack, 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 tack. The man looked at the phone screen. The YouTube video was still playing, but the black thumbnail had changed. It was now a live feed of a car interior. A man in a damp raincoat, screaming silently behind a paper window. You see, dear listener, the voice said, the voice of the editor, the voice of the God author, the voice that was now speaking directly to you. The final draft is never truly finished. It just changes hands. Corvus Blackwood was the first. Caleb Frost was the second. And the man in the car? He's the third. He's the one who will build the next estate, find the next ghostwriter, and harvest the next set of memories. In the car, the man began to unravel. His raincoat turned into gray paper. His skin turned into newsprint. His eyes became two dark, weeping inkwells. But what about you? The voice whispered, dropping to an intimate, terrifying hiss. You've been listening for 13 chapters. You let the ink into your ears. You visualized the cellar, the fire, and the void. You've given the story a place to live. The man in the car vanished, leaving only a stack of cream-colored paper on the seat. Every story needs a reader, but every masterpiece needs a victim. Thank you for listening to the final draft. We hope you enjoyed the ending. Now look behind you. Silence. Thank you for listening to Final Draft, a Shiver Audiobooks production. We've traveled a long way together, from the rain-drenched gates of Blackwood Estate to the ink-stained corridors of the East Wing, and finally into the shifting, paper-thin reality where the fate of the soul was decided in a single stroke of a pen. Caleb's journey reminds us that in a world governed by cold narratives and calculated plot twists, the most powerful thing we still possess is our own beautiful, messy agency. The final edit has been interrupted. The manuscript has been given a heartbeat, and the ghostwriter has finally fought his way out of the margins and back into the light. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, please consider leaving a like and sharing the video. It's the best way to help our channel grow and ensures we can keep bringing these high-stakes, cinematic worlds to life. A massive thank you to our subscribers. You are the Inkwell resistance that keeps these stories alive. Without your support, tales like this will remain buried in the parched dust of forgotten archive. Before you go, let us know in the comments. If you found out that your life was being written by an author you could never meet, would you follow the script to the end, or would you dare to seize the pen? Is a happy ending worth the risk of a blank page? Until the next chapter is opened, stay alert, stay curious, and keep reading between the lines.